The Spirituality of Saint Francis Xavier. The Christogram Ihs is the symbol of Jesus in the form of an acronym IHS. An acronym is a word that is formed from the initial letters of a name. This acronym IHS is in the Greek language and it is the first three initial letters of the word Jesus in Greek, that is Jesus. So IHS stands for Jesus. They appeared also in Latin interpretations of the abbreviation IHS like Jesus Hominum Salvator, Jesus Savior of Men, and so on. The religious order congregation of the Society of Jesus, who are popularly called Jesuits, adopted IHS as its emblem, the symbol, in the 16th century. This religious congregation was founded in 1540 by Saint Ignatius of Loyola. In fact, if you enter the Basilica Born Jesus in Old Goa, the huge statue is not of Francis Xavier but of Ignatius of Loyola. Francis Xavier belonged to this order of the Jesuits and was one of the founding fathers. What is spirituality? The spirituality of Saint Francis Xavier is centered on God. So before we reflect on the spirituality of Saint Francis Xavier, let us first see what is spirituality. In the book of Genesis, in the second creation story, that is Genesis chapter 2, we see that human beings are created out of the dust of the earth and the breath of life. Animals are created only out of dust of the earth and do not have the breath of life. The dust of the earth symbolizes the biological life, the physical life of the human being, whereas the breath of life signifies the spiritual life. The dust of the earth represents our cravings, our desires to survive in this world, food, clothing, and shelter. Whereas the breath of life characterizes our cravings, our desire for God, for spiritual matters. Just as there are ways to nourish your biological life, there are ways to take care of your spiritual life. This pathway to nourish your spiritual life is called spirituality. Spirituality is a way to feed your desire for God or spiritual matters. In order to be a complete human being, you have to satisfy both the elements that are engraved in you, dust of the earth as well as the breath of life. Thus, to be a complete human being, you have to look after your physical body as well as your spiritual life. If you neglect either of the two, you will end up in a crisis, a depression. Just as there are many ways to look after your physical body, similarly there are a number of spiritualities to take care of your spiritual life. You have to find the one which best suits you. Some of the examples of spirituality are Franciscan, Dominican, Benedictine, the Redemptorists, the Carmelites, and the Charismatic. These spiritualities do not contradict each other. They only help us in a spiritual search. At the same time, every one of us will not be able to respond or relate to all these spiritualities. Some may respond well with Franciscan spiritualities, others may not. Some may respond to charismatic spirituality. No spirituality can be considered to be greater than the other. It all depends on how well you respond to a particular one. Thus, it is for us to search which spirituality we respond best. That is, in which spirituality I find God and satisfy the breath of life within me. The Ignatian Spirituality is the spirituality of Saint Francis Xavier, who was the founder of the Society of Jesus, and the founder of the Jesuits was Ignatius of Loyola. This spirituality is commonly called Ignatian Spirituality, which is a spirituality for everyday life, and it insists that God is present in our world and is active in our lives. We do not have to withdraw from the world in order to find God. It is He, God, who comes in search for us. We only have to respond to Him in the right way. Ignatius did not feel that God was calling him to a monastic spirituality, but that the Spirit of the Lord was leading him into the midst of the world, to go through the towns and villages proclaiming the good news. This is what inspired Francis Xavier to find God in all things he was doing, or rather to allow God to find him in the work he was doing. How can we find God in our life? This question can be very vague, very abstract to find God. None of us have seen God with our physical eyes. None of us have touched Him with our hands. None of us have heard Him with our physical ears, and so on. So how can we find God who is not accessible to our five senses? We as human beings are limited to our senses. All our information knowledge comes from five senses. Supernatural knowledge takes a lot of time to enter into us. It requires a certain amount of maturity. A young student or even an ordinary adult will find it very vague and unrealistic to talk about God. We all know that prayer is a communication to God. That is, it is a relationship to God. How can you have a communication or relationship with someone whom you cannot see, cannot hear, cannot touch? It is easy for me to have a relationship with my companions because I can talk to them, listen to them, see them, etc. But with God, how is a relationship possible? Secondly, how do I know that when I pray, I'm actually having a relationship with God? I could be having relationship with my ego, with myself, or I could be having communication with the evil spirit instead. How to find out this? This is how the Ignatian Spirituality guides us. If you had such type of questions like how to find God in your daily life, how to find God in your work, how to know if God is leading you or evil spirit is leading you, how to make good decisions and so on. If you have such type of question, then your spirituality is an Ignatian type. Ignatius tells us that it is God who first comes in search of us and He comes to us in everyday life. Ignatian spirituality is rooted in the conviction that God is active, personal and present to us. We don't have to withdraw from the world to a quiet place in order to find God, for God's footprints can be found everywhere in our work, relationship, family, friends, sorrows, joys, beauty of nature and mundane details of daily lives. In other words, God calls and we respond. God calls us at every moment of our lives and we respond to this calling, but we may be responding in the negative. This means that the choices and decisions we make in our daily lives either push us away from God or draw us more closely to God. How does God communicate to us? God does not communicate to us directly through our physical senses. Rather, God communicates to us through interior movements. What are these interior movements? Interior movements consist of thoughts, imagination, emotion, desires, feelings, repulsions, attractions and so on. Every moment you go through these interior movements. Even while you are engrossed in your work, you go through these interior movements. For example, either you are caught up in your thoughts, imagination, either you have strong desires or cravings for something, either you are feeling low or high or insipid, either you are attracted to something or somebody. You are going through some strong feeling of peace, love, compassion or anger, hatred, jealousy and so on. Thus, when you work, your spiritual life is not turned off. It is very much present. Spiritual life is not only active in prayer, it is very much present in the rut of daily activity. Just because you are not aware of it, that does not mean it has stopped functioning. Ignatian spirituality helps us to become sensitive, to be aware of the movements, feelings, desires and ambitions. Ignatian spirituality helps us to reflect on them and understand where the feelings, desires, thoughts, etc. come from and where they lead us to. Are they coming from God and leading us to God, or are they coming from something else, some other source leading us elsewhere? Once we know from where these interior movements come from, then we can respond to them accordingly. Thus, we can make choices and decisions doing the will of God. For example, I have a strong ambition to do something. I find out that it is taking me to God. Then I make the decision in the positive. But if I find out that it is taking me selfishly to myself, then I will make the decision in the negative. The question you will have is, how do I know if my feeling, ambition, etc. is taking me to God or elsewhere? Here the Ignatian spirituality has a number of routes which we will not discuss. But in Ignatian spirituality, you must have a spiritual director who will help you find out if your interior movement is taking you to God or elsewhere in order to make good decisions. Thus, Francis Xavier responded to God not only in his personal prayer but also in his day-to-day work. When I say respond to God in your everyday work, it does not mean that while working I will stop suddenly and ask where is God. If you do this, then the movement will be lost. It is like when you are enjoying the sunset or a beautiful flower, allow the beauty of that moment to capture you. Do not stop and think, is God there? Then the moment is lost. The examine of consciousness. In Ignatian spirituality, when you work fully, putting your whole self into it. You do not stop to philosophize or spiritualize your work or day. However, it is at the end of the day and after you finish the work that you do something known as an examine. This technical word for this examine is the examine of consciousness. Examine of consciousness is different from examine of conscience. Examine of conscience is right or wrong, good or bad. So examine of conscience is when you look back at your work or your day to see if you have done the work right or wrong, what mistakes you made, what are your plus points, etc. In examine of consciousness, consciousness means presence. So examine of consciousness is to look back at your work or your day to see where the presence of God was in your work or day and how you responded to Him. There are simple 5 steps to make an examine of consciousness. These 5 steps are advisable at the end of the day before you retire to bed, and it takes only 7 minutes. This examine will help you to know the presence of God in your life and how to rightly respond to Him. Step 1. Begin by thanking the Lord for the whole day. Step 2. Ask God to give you the grace to look into the day to see how He was present in your day and how you responded to Him. Step 3 is look back at the day right from the time you woke up in the morning to the moment that you are doing your examine. In other words, relive the day with the feelings, desires, thoughts, etc. like a film or a movie of your life where you have gone through a lot of interior movements. Take one interior movement now in step 4, either feeling or a thought or an imagination that you went through during the day, and look at it closely. Ask the question, how was God present in it and how did you respond to Him? Step 5. Thank God again and ask Him again for His grace so that the following day when He makes Himself present to you, you respond to Him in the right way. This is what Francis Xavier as a Jesuit did, and this is what every Jesuit does at the end of the day. Ignatius tells the Jesuit that even if one day they forget to pray or do not find time to pray, they must never mix an examine of consciousness, because there is where one learns how to make God present to us and how we respond to Him. This then guides one to make right decision choices according to will of God. Ignatian spirituality deeply rooted in the conviction that God is present in our world and is active in our lives.